Hello, and welcome to the Word on the Streets March Book of the Month feature. In conversation this month are Nathan Niigan Noodin Adler, author of Wrist, an Indigenous monster story, who now brings us Ghost Lake, 13 companion stories to the novel. And in the interviewer's chair is founder, publisher, acquisitions editor, and art director of Kegedonce Press Kateri Akiwenzie-Damm. A bit of background on our guests. Nathan is an artist and filmmaker who works in a variety of mediums, including audio and video and drawing and painting. His writing is published in various magazines, blogs, and anthologies. He is Two-Spirit, Jewish, Anishinaabe, and a member of Lac des Mille Lacs First Nation. Originally from Ontario, he currently resides in Vancouver. Kateri teaches at U of T Scarborough, teaching creative writing, Indigenous literatures, and oral traditions in the English department. And I'll leave it to them to talk more about Ghost Lake.
Ani, hi Nathan. Hi, it's really good to see you again, and I'm really happy to have this opportunity to speak with you today, especially about Ghost Lake. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to just have a chat about it.
I don't think we've ever talked face to face about it. It's just all been email, and yeah.
It has been. So this is a unique opportunity. So Nathan, for those who don't know, you've also written a novel, Wrist, that's set in the same fictitious Anishinaabe community as Ghost Lake. So tell us, how do the short stories in Ghost Lake relate to the novel?
Well, when I don't know if they relate directly in terms of like the plot, but like it's really about the setting, right? So because I had built this whole universe, because it's an urban fantasy world. So when you're writing urban fantasy, you have to make the rules in which the world works. How it's like world building, right? So then when I was starting to write the stories, I already had this world I built for the novel. So it was just easier for me to set the stories in that world. And then also there was all these little minor characters who had made little tiny appearances or references, and then I could, and also I was wanting to, just explore more in that world. So that's how they kind of relate. It's like the same universe, but different plots kind of thing, different characters.
So you say you've created this world of Ghost Lake. Do you think that you're going to continue to set your stories in Ghost Lake?
I think so, yeah. Well, some of them anyway, because I've written other fictional stories that are in different universes, kind of thing. But this one, I have other kind of stories in mind for some of the characters and so I want to continue some of the little story arcs that started in Ghost Lake, where there was like little, like Zaude's character, she has 3 stories in the book. And so each story has its own little narrative arc, but that I feel like she could have even like a longer story kind of thing. And there's other characters like Ewan, who's like a crow. He's a non-human character, and I feel like he could have more of a story. So there's other characters that are referred to or that or appear here and there, but they could have their own backstories that I could explore more. Like a character that's just a secondary character in one of the stories could then go on to have their own whole narrative that it could build, and it could all be in the same world. So anytime I write something, it always feels like I'm creating this little world, but then there's all these references to other things that are backstories, and I could always explore those parts of the characters. So
right, it's interesting that you said backstory, because I'm really curious about the name of the place, Ghost Lake. Is there a backstory to that?
When I was trying to come up with a name for because it was just a setting in Wrist, right? So I would just like, and Wrist is horror, urban fantasy, kind of social realism, like across different genres, but a lot of it is in that horror genre. So I was like, okay, it needs to sound spooky. So that was my main criteria. Okay, it needs to be kind of a spooky name for a place, and Ghost Lake really does and fit thematically in terms of like being haunted by the past and history and those kinds of themes. So it just fit in terms of like theme and also the spooky criteria. So it checked both boxes.
It seems like the setting and that place is almost a character in both the novel and the short stories.
Very much so, I think, especially with Ghost Lake, because each character has their arc, little story arc, but then the place is in the background always, right? So this one, Riss, was also set in the fictional city of Sterling, like a small town kind of. So, but this one was all mostly set in the Ghost Lake community. So it felt like every story had this the setting and the scenery was always there. So each time you read one of the stories, you'll see a little bit more of the history of the place and what the place is about, and it's really what ties it all together. And so each character is like almost like a little what would you call, a vignette kind of that's showing you more, opening up a little bit more about in this world and in this setting. So you learn a bit more about the place as you read.
Right. So the stories themselves are very much based in Anishinaabeg community, and they draw a lot on Anishinaabeg knowledge systems and language and story. So I know, as far as I understand, you grew up north of Toronto, and I'm just curious how you learned all of this.
So when I was writing Wrist, I was like, I was setting it in a fictional reserve, which is Ghost Lake, right? So I was drawing on my knowledge of Lac First Nation, which is like my mom's community and my community, which is in Northern Ontario, and also Cape Croker a little bit too, because those are the two reserves where I spend a lot of time. So those were the two communities I was, in terms of like setting and in real life, that I was drawing on. So the setting of Ghost Lake has very similar history to Lac du Mille. Like there was flooding, people are pushed out of the off the lands, and people are returning. So that's also a real life kind of narrative for Lac du Mille, because my mom was born, or grew up near the reserve and going to school up north. And my grandmother was born there, but then I grew up in Southern Ontario. But we would go visit every summer. We would spend 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, and we'd stay in a cabin on the reserve. And so our mom really made sure that we had a sense of our home territory and where we come from. So that's and that community is really fictionalized a lot in Ghost Lake. So.
And in terms of the language, you use the language. It's not written in both languages, but you use the language quite a bit in your writing. So, are you learning the language, fluent in the language?
I'm not fluent, but I've been trying to learn for years. I took classes with Shirley Williams at Trent. So I learned like some basic, like, the beginning kind of, which I'm still a beginner, right? But and she taught me to use the language, however much I know, just use it, because that's how you learn, right? So that's what I try to do, and for me, it's a way of decolonizing, is just using the language, right? Even if I'm not fluent, if I know a word, I try to use it, right? And then when my grandmother was getting older, she had dementia, so she was as she was getting older, she was starting to speak more of the language, and then like more and more, she would just be speaking Anishinaabe, and it was because I knew some of the words. I knew what she was saying, right? So sometimes I wouldn't know what she was saying, and sometimes I would, because I would hear some of the words. I'd be like, "Oh, you're asking for this," or you know what I mean. So I was really grateful that I had that like basis in the language, so that I could even. Otherwise, there would have been a communication barrier, right? And yeah, so for me, I've always been trying to use the language as a way of like learning, and also as a way of decolonizing, basically.
Is your grandmother the one who taught you Anishinaabe stories?
I mean, she told stories, but I don't know if she taught me like this is how Anishinaabe tell stories. I read a lot, and my mom tells a ton of stories. My mom's a storyteller too. She has tons of stories. My aunt has stories. My cousin Shirley has stories. So I get stories from whether they're like, a lot of them are just family history, right? So I draw on that method of oral storytelling in my writing too, because when you think of the way my mom tells stories, she always starts with okay, this is an ancestor, this is how they were born, this was their profession, and then this is how they died. So then that's the narrative structure. She always, it's just the way she tells stories. So when I was writing Rift, actually, I was thinking that's how I'll structure my stories, based on that oral storytelling structure. So I was thinking, okay, well, this is the character's name, this is when they were born and how they were born, this is what they did, a little story from their life, and then how they die. So that's why there's characters are always dying, because I have to tell them how they were born, how they died, and then something from the middle, and then yeah.
Oh, interesting. I never knew that. So are there any protocols that you follow or concerns you have when you're writing about that, or things that you will or won't write about in that regard?
Let me think. Well, I think that when it comes to family stories, I feel like they're my stories to share, and but I'm fictionalizing or drawing on inspiration, so I'm not telling those stories the way they are. So I might not share that if I'm drawing on a family story for inspiration, I might not share the real story because it's a family story, but I might draw on it for inspiration for a fictional story. So the fictional story is a variation on that, so it feels like it's its own separate thing aside from the story. So I might not share the personal, private family story, but I'll share like a variation that feels like it's a separate thing. So it feels like I'm making it my own kind of thing. So I'm able to share it.
So you have an innate sense of what you want to share and kind of where those boundaries are for you and your family about what is kept private.
In a sense, like I'm working on a nonfiction story now, actually, and I interviewed my mom and my grandma and my aunt and my uncle about their experiences in residential school, and that story they all know. Okay, I'm going to be retelling these stories in a different format and for a writing project. So they all know that these stories are the ones that the stories that they're telling me are going to be turned into a narrative that I'm working on. So in terms of, I have their permission to do it. So in that sense, yeah.
So in reading the stories in Ghost Lake, it seems to me that all of the stories are looking at the idea of what a monster is, of what is frightening or threatening, and how that reflects differences in worldviews and lived experiences between Anishinaabe and settler Canadians. Is that part of what you were wanting to explore in these stories?
Definitely, yeah. So when I was, because I'm working in this horror genre, right? So horror often has monsters or deals with themes of the monstrous, right? So if you're thinking like an evil spirit or some sort of monster, then I was trying to think about it in a little bit different ways, because say you're telling an apocalypse story. Well, in First Nations communities, they've dealt with the apocalypse. You know what I mean? It's already happened. So a pandemic where there's disease, well, that we've already lived through that. There's been smallpox and all kinds of catastrophe after catastrophe. It's already happened. So the end of the world has happened and we're still here. And so if you're going to tell that story, how is it going to be different from a mainstream narrative where they're exploring these things as potential realities, and then for Indigenous communities, they're already real things. So if you're telling a horror story from a mainstream perspective, it's a potential, and then if you're First Nations, it's already a real thing. So it's more of a social realism versus exploration of fear, because that's what horror is exploration of fear. So when you're and as an Indigenous writer that's writing in the horror genre, I'm exploring fear, but then there's a tension between the reality of historic trauma and survival, and then also the exploration of that as a potential that is a real thing. So there's the reality, and then there's the potential, and in a genre that mostly is supposed to be an exploration of fear as a potential when it's a real thing. So that's the kind of a tension between those two things, I think.
I heard you speak about Ghost Lake before, and one of the things that struck me was you were talking about one of the stories, and you wrote it because you were trying to get out of writing in response to colonialism. And I've been thinking about that a lot, because it's interesting how often since I've noticed that's exactly what I'm doing. Is it's very difficult to not write in response to colonialism, because that's what we're enmeshed in and experiencing. Do you think you were successful in being able to do that?
Well, in some sense, yeah. Like with Wrist, I felt like I was like really writing about the trauma of colonialism, and I was dealing with it. I was working through that, and like there's a reason people are doing that, because they're still healing and they need to focus on that and deal with it, right? So a lot of art and storytelling is about that. But then I wanted to, because I wanted to tell a story that didn't reference colonialism, that was just going to be its own thing without being sad about being colonized. So with Tyner's Creek, it was more about I was going to set it in a prehistoric time before colonization happened. So then I can't be a story about colonization or being sad about being colonized because it hasn't happened yet. But I still feel like even if you set out to write a story that isn't addressing colonialism, it'll still pop up anyway. It'll still be there, but at least it's not as direct as like because it was still about the land and not knowing the word for the name of the river, and then I was trying to write an origin story to kind of fictionally create the name of the river and where it comes from. So it was, some of that was kind of there as well, embedded in the story. So it does come up, even when you try to avoid it, it still crops up a bit. But at least it's not so enmeshed in the as directly kind of barreling through the dealing with colonization and the trauma.
Or it can be read that way. I mean, even when you don't write it that way, it can be read as a metaphor for, or that sort of thing. I'm just wondering, what do you hope readers will take away from reading Ghost Lake?
Well, I hope they enjoy reading the stories, first of all, because some of them are pretty punchy, I think. But I hope they maybe they learn some of the language a bit, and maybe they get a sense of First Nations people as being like alive and human, and and that some of these stories aren't about colonialism or being bogged down, and showing people in more real ways, but also not always, because it's also urban fantasy, right? So or some of them are straight up mystery. There's a lot of genres in the book. So
before we go, would you read a little bit for us? Give us a taste of what Ghost Lake is actually like.
Sure. Should I do a 2-minute or a 3-minute reading? What do you think?
Let's just give them a little taste. 2 minutes.
Okay, all right. Okay. Okay, so I'll read a section from this story called Intermediaries, and it's one of the longer stories in the book. So it's got 3 different narratives, and they're all kind of braided together. So it's near the end of the book. Hey there, champ, a voice says. Well, what? Clay cracks open a bleary eyelid, not wanting to be dragged to wakefulness. There's a face 2 inches away from his own. Their noses are almost touching. He feels a tickle in the whiskers of his blonde mustache. Ah! Clay lets out a short shriek and recoils from the too close face. His heart suddenly kicks into 4th gear from a dead start, hammering in his chest like madly rotating pistons. What the hell, man? You scared the shit out of me. Aya is silently chortling to himself, hand covering his mouth, taking perverse joy in Clay's fear. I know, the dead man says. That's what's so funny. Forearm across his abs as if they are sore from laughing so hard. His hair hangs long and straight now, free from its braids. What are you doing here? Clay hisses. You're gonna wake up my parents. Aya tilts his head for a moment, as if listening. Asleep as a stone. Then he looks back at Clay. Thought you could get rid of me so easily, did you? What do you want? Clay stutters. I already returned your jaw. Aya waves his hand. Manu, all's forgotten that's forgiven. He wriggles his fingers like the caricature of a ghost, elbows raised, fringed leather of his coat dangling, shoulders hunched, low register drawl. I came here to warn you. Then he speaks. As he speaks, there's a distant growling which punctuates his word. Though Clay knows he's trying to be funny, those snarls kind of undercut the humor. A ghost pretending to be a ghost.
Thank you so much, Miigwech. Okay, thanks. It's been wonderful to get a chance to speak with you finally about the book.
Yeah.
And for those who are looking for it, you can find the book at your local bookstore, or you can order it at www.kegedonce.com. Miigwech, it's been a pleasure, Nathan.
Nice talking to you, Kateri. Miigwech.
Take care.